I want to go next into the layers of the skin. We're going to do the general layers with tissue types, and then in a future lecture, I'll go into sub-layers for each one as well. So to start with, this is a diagram of the skin similar to what's in your book. And here we can see that on the left side here, this is where I want to focus right now. The accessory structures we'll come back to later. Do note they're embedded in different layers differently. So like the epidermis doesn't have blood vessels, for example. So let's actually start there. First, we're looking at the cutaneous membrane is another name for the skin. Remember in the previous lecture, I talked about serous and mucous membranes. We'll talk about synovial and meninges later. So the cutaneous membrane is the last membrane type I'll talk about for now. It's made up of both connective and epithelial tissue. So cutaneous membrane consists of the epidermis and the dermis. The epidermis is the most superficial. You probably heard this term, right? Your epidermis, that's your skin, that's the top layer. It is these top two layers here. The dark purple here, this is like what you'll see in lab, those dark purple nuclei that make up that thick, simple stratified squamous epithelium. On top of that, there's dead cells. These cells contain keratin, which is a waterproof protein that helps to protect the skin. I'll come back to this keratin later. So that's the top layer right there. The epithelium is actually made up of sublayers that I'll come back to as we talk about skin growth. This can regenerate as these dead cells slough off and die. Below the epidermis, epi means on top, is the dermis. The dermis is made up of two different types of connective tissue. The papillary layer is made up of areolar tissue. That's about right here. And the reticular layer is made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. The reticular layer is not made up of reticular fibers, which are a thing. Just, that's what it's called. So reticular layer is this big section right here, dense, irregular connective tissue, which helps it withstand force in many different directions. That's the cutaneous membrane. Below the cutaneous membrane, there's the subcutaneous membrane below the cutaneous membrane. The hypodermis is another name for this. So hypo, below, or low to the dermis. This actually isn't a part of the skin or integumentary system, but is associated with it. So I do want you to know it's here and draw it if I tell you to. This is adipose tissue, fat cells that are associated with many different organs kind of underneath them. So you can see a lot of these different layers here are associated with different types of functions. We've got protection from outside kind of abrasions or chemicals with that epidermis. We've got protection from physical forces. And then we've got padding with that fat. One more thing to note here is that papillary layer, remember that's that areolar tissue. That's also what's located in our mucous membrane below the epithelial tissue. And so that's often that glue. It's gluing the epithelial cells to some underlying structure. And that's true here as well. All right, let's look at this in a histology slide. This is actually a slide of what you'll see in lab next to that same picture I just drew. So I'm going to go through this as well. So epidermis is this entire purple layer here, all the way from the top. This would be the outside of the body, all the way to the bottom of the purple. Remember, epithelial cells tend to stain very purple. We'll talk about those layers all look different, right? Like this looks different than the white part, looks different than that other line. We'll talk about those layers, the layers of the epidermis next. Below the epidermis, we've got the dermis, and specifically the papillary layer. That goes from about here down to about right here. It's kind of hard to see the bridge between the papillary and reticular layers. This is that areolar tissue that's made up of a bunch of different tissue types, including collagen fibers, which is why it's actually kind of hard to distinguish between the reticular layer, which contains all collagen fibers. So below the papillary layer, there's the reticular layer down here. That's that dense, irregular connective tissue. Below that then, there is the hypodermis fat cells. You can see large goblets of fat in all of the cells there. So this is what you'll also see and draw in lab. This is an example of thick skin. Here I just want to do a quick comparison of thick and thin skin. We'll be looking at thick skin primarily because it's easier to identify things and see all the layers. Fingertip is an example of where you have thick skin. So it's got this huge layer of that outer epidermis. It's called the stratum corneum, a horny layer. The thin skin doesn't have that same thick layer. So we'll be looking primarily at thick skin in this class. So what we've done so far here is draw, describe, identify the layers of the skin. So that's from the epidermis down to the subcutaneous layer. I say skin in quotes because the subcutaneous layer technically isn't part of the skin, but you will see it there. And then what tissue types make up each layer. So you'll do this in lab as well. You'll draw the layers of the skin and then tell me, okay, here's the papillary layer, that's areolar tissue. Here's a reticular layer of the dermis, that's dense irregular connective tissue. And so these are the terms that you should know from this lecture.